trying to keep up with everything going on in the world right now can feel kind of impossible, right? Like there's just so much information flying around.
Yeah, for sure.
You know, it's like you're stuck in this dense forest and can't see the bigger picture at all.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
So that's what we're going to do today. Cut through some of that noise. We're going to take a deep dive into a really crucial aspect of the situation in Ukraine, which is their finances and the reported scale of their military losses.
Right.
We've got some in-depth analyses here that don't really paint the most optimistic picture.
No, they don't.
Our goal is to break all that down for you, give you a better understanding of the challenges they're facing and what things might look like down the line. Okay, so let's jump right into this. Let's start with the whole financial landscape.
Yeah, okay. One of the first things that, really stands out is that even if the war were to end soon, even if there was peace tomorrow, Ukraine's long-term financial situation looks incredibly precarious. And one of the things that I find really concerning is that there doesn't seem to be any clear budget plan that goes beyond 2025.
Oh, wow.
There's this real lack of a long-term strategy. So it raises serious questions about how they're going to handle things in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you'd think that having a plan for after the war would be like a top priority, wouldn't you?
You would, absolutely.
I mean, it seems obvious that even if the fighting stops, the financial burdens aren't just going to disappear overnight.
No, not at all. And in fact, what we're seeing from these reports is that a rapid reduction in military spending back to pre-war levels is just not likely to happen.
Okay.
Even with a ceasefire, you have to remember the sheer size of Ukraine's armed forces now. It's almost 900,000 people.
Wow.
So even just maintaining that force, even without active fighting, is a massive financial burden.
Yeah.
And then you add on top of that the need to compensate the casualties they've suffered, and it becomes even more enormous. And sadly, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of casualties.
Hundreds of thousands.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands.
God, that's almost too big a number to even really comprehend. The human cost alone is just tragic. And then you think about all the financial support those individuals and their families are going to need. It's just really underscores how deep and far-reaching the impact of this conflict really is.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the impact on their budget overall. I mean, how has this affected their national spending priorities?
Well, it's been a pretty dramatic shift. Since 2021, their defense spending has increased tenfold. Tenfold. Just to put that into context, before the war, their biggest expenditure was social welfare programs.
Okay.
That's completely flipped. Defense spending now dominates everything. It really shows just how much pressure this war has put on their finances.
Yeah. I mean, a tenfold increase. It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
So with this huge shift in spending toward the military, what does that mean for their budget deficit? I mean, how bad is it? It's pretty bad. Since 2022, they've been running a budget deficit of over 22% of their GDP on average. And, looking ahead to 2025, the projected shortfall is something like $41.5 billion.
$41.5 billion.
And it's important to remember, that's assuming they manage to slightly decrease defense spending. If the war continues at this intensity, that deficit could easily be even larger.
Right. So with a gap that huge, how are they even managing to function right now? Where is all this money coming from?
Well, basically, all their domestic revenue, things like taxes and customs duties, that's barely enough to cover their defense costs right now.
Wow.
And that's even after they've made some significant tax increases.
Oh, really?
Yeah, their total tax revenue has more than doubled since the war began.
Wow.
And personal income tax, that's gone up by over 200%. And you have to consider, they're doing this in an economy where, according to the Wilson Center, about half the population is already living at a basic subsistence level.
So they're basically squeezing every penny they can out of their own economy, even though, like, a huge chunk of their population is already just struggling to survive.
Exactly.
That sounds incredibly risky. Like, how long can that possibly be sustained?
Well, and that's where the reliance on outside support comes in. Since they've been cut off from international capital markets, they've become completely dependent on aid and loans from Western countries to make up for this huge gap in their budget.
Yeah.
And those contributions have been essential. They've been using them for everything from, paying public sector salaries to keeping essential services running.
We've all heard about these Western aid packages, but has the nature of that aid changed at all over the course of the war?
Yeah, it has. There's been a pretty noticeable shift. At first, a lot of the Western support came in the form of grants, basically free money. And that was supposed to cover both their immediate budget needs and their military expenses. The US and the EU were the main providers of this direct budget help. But since the beginning of 2024, there's been a clear move towards lending instead of grants. And I think that reflects a growing concern among some Western governments about the long-term costs of just handing out money indefinitely.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So while this shift means Ukraine's still getting the money they desperately need right now, it also means their debt is piling up.
Right.
And that could really hinder their economic recovery after the war.
So they're essentially taking on more and more debt just to keep going. What does that mean for their economic stability down the road?
Well, the effects are already being felt. Their national debt is now over 100% of their GDP.
Wow.
And crucially, the cost of servicing that debt has tripled. It's now their second largest budget expenditure after military spending. To give you an idea of just how serious this is, in 2025, they're projected to spend more than twice as much on debt repayments as they are on healthcare for their entire population.
That's just crazy. I mean, spending more on debt than on healthcare, that's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. And it raises serious concerns about the well-being of ordinary Ukrainians even after the war ends. It could lead to all sorts of social and economic problems down the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
And unfortunately, it's a ratio that's only going to get worse the longer this conflict drags on.
Right. And even though, they have things like the G7 Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loan,
right,
which they agreed to back in June 2024 with the U.S. contributing through the World Bank, I mean, that's going to provide some support for rebuilding infrastructure in 2025, but it's not general budget support.
No, it's not.
And it's really remarkable that there are no clear plans in place for how they're going to meet their budgetary needs after 2025.
Right.
Even if the war were to end immediately, it's just not realistic to think they can simply go back to pre-war spending levels.
No.
Not with the ongoing security risks and the size of their military now.
Yeah.
So even in the most optimistic scenario, they're still facing this huge financial cliff in just over a year.
Yeah, basically. If they want to balance their budget in 2026, they'd need to cut military spending by about 80%. That's around $41 billion. And, understandably, Kyiv is going to be very reluctant to make such drastic cuts given the threats they still face.
Of course.
So even with significant reductions, they're probably still going to be looking at a pretty big deficit, maybe around $20 billion.
Okay. Are there any other ways for them to bridge that gap? I mean, are there other options?
Well, the IMF doesn't think they'll be able to access international lending markets again until 2027. So that means they're going to have to keep relying on financial assistance from other countries for the foreseeable future.
Okay.
But that's not necessarily a sure thing. There's the potential for a change in U.S. foreign policy, maybe a new administration that's less willing to provide financial support.
Right.
And then you have the growing political opposition within Europe to giving Ukraine more aid, even if there's a ceasefire. So securing the funds they'll need is going to be incredibly difficult.
It really does sound like an incredibly uncertain and risky financial situation for them going forward. Okay, well, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about the reported military losses. This is obviously a really sensitive topic, and it's very difficult to get accurate information.
It is. It really is. And before we even get into the numbers, I think it's important to acknowledge just how hard it is to get reliable data on casualties during an active conflict. There's the fog of war. There's the natural tendency for all sides to downplay their own losses and maybe exaggerate the enemy's. It's all about morale and strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we have to look at any figures we come across with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Exactly. We need to be aware of potential biases and understand that the information might not be complete.
Okay, so with that in mind, what are some of the estimates that are out there regarding Ukrainian military losses?
Well, one that really caught my eye was from a British portal called Headpost. Back in November 2024, they reported that Ukrainian losses since the beginning of the conflict were around 1 million.
1 million.
Yeah, 1 million. Their calculation was based on a couple of things. First, there was a statement from Alexander Litvinenko saying that about 1.65 million Ukrainians had served on the front lines at some point.
Okay.
And then there was a Forbes report that estimated the active fighting force to be around 850,000.
Okay.
So based on those numbers, Headpress figured there had been roughly 800,000 irreversible losses by late 2024. And by irreversible losses, they mean killed, captured, or deserted.
God, 1 million. That's just a staggering number. It's hard to even imagine. So how do these estimates from outside sources compare with the official numbers coming out of Kyiv?
Well, there's a pretty big difference. In February 2025, Zelensky gave an interview where he said that Ukrainian losses were about 46,000 killed and 380,000 wounded.
Yep.
And earlier in February 2024, he'd said the number of killed was 31,000.
Okay.
But considering how intense the fighting has been throughout 2024 and into 2025, it's hard to believe that the real numbers are that low.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge discrepancy. You're going from tens of thousands in official reports to potentially 1 million, according to other estimates. What could explain such a big difference?
Well, there are a few things that might be going on. First of all, Kiev is definitely trying to keep morale up.
Of course.
Especially with the war that's been going on for so long.
Right.
And, events like the attempted incursion into Kursk, where Ukraine suffered heavy losses, those kinds of things would have a really negative impact on morale if the true extent of the casualties were made public.
Right. I mean, any government at war is going to want to project an image of strength and resilience. But this just shows how difficult it is to get a handle on the true human cost of this conflict.
It does.
And it's not just about those killed or wounded in battle either, right? There's also the whole issue of desertion, which we've been hearing about.
Yeah, that's right. There are reports that desertion and unauthorized absences from military units are a big problem.
Okay.
And that's likely due to a number of factors. You have the forced conscription of people who might not be properly trained or motivated.
Right.
And then there's just a general war weariness, especially with talk of potential ceasefires. I mean, as the conflict potentially nears its end, some people are understandably reluctant to risk their lives.
Yeah, I mean, who wants to die in the final days of a war?
Exactly.
So we're talking about people actively trying to avoid being sent to the front lines or even leaving their units altogether. Do we have any sense of how widespread this is? What kind of numbers are we talking about?
HeadPost, that same British source we talked about before, they reported around 170,000 cases of desertion by November 2024.
Wow.
And some Ukrainian journalists, like Volodymyr Boyko, have suggested even higher numbers, like 200,000.
Okay.
The New York Times said that 51,000 soldiers left their units between January and September 2024 alone.
Wow.
And The Economist estimated a desertion rate of about 20%.
Okay.
And then you have reports from the National Interest about Ukrainian men doing really desperate things to avoid conscription, like risking their lives to cross borders illegally.
God, yeah. Those numbers are really concerning. It suggests there are some pretty serious problems with morale and operational capacity within the Ukrainian armed forces.
Right.
And if they're losing soldiers faster than they can replace them, that's a major problem for their ability to keep defending themselves.
It is. And Yevhen Diki, he's a Ukrainian veteran and former commander of the 8R Battalion. He's said that the rate of mobilization is about 1.5 times lower than the rate at which they're losing soldiers. And the New York Times has reported that Kyiv is mobilizing about 20,000 new recruits every month.
Okay.
So if you put those figures together, it looks like their monthly losses could be at least 30,000 killed and wounded.
Wow. So even with their ongoing mobilization efforts, they're still losing ground in terms of overall troop numbers.
That's right.
And of course, the fighting has continued into 2025.
It has.
So if you start with that estimated 1 million losses by the end of last year, and then factor in the continued fighting, particularly those heavy casualties in places like Kursk and Belgorod, it seems very likely that the total number of Ukrainian military losses is now even higher.
Yeah.
Even if you use a conservative estimate of 30,000 losses per month for the first 4 months of this year, they could already be well over 1 million.
Right.
And to put that into some kind of historical context, the analysis we've been looking at mentions Polish casualties during World War I.
Yeah, they said that out of about 2 million Poles who fought in that war, around 450,000 were killed. So that gives you an idea of the sheer scale of the losses Ukraine might be dealing with.
Yeah.
And then when you consider that Zelensky has said there are about 880,000 personnel in the Ukrainian armed forces right now, well, some of these higher estimates of losses suggest that they've already lost more soldiers than the current size of their army.
Wow. It's mind-blowing. It really paints a bleak picture, both in terms of their finances and the human cost of this conflict. And it makes you wonder how much longer they can realistically keep fighting.
Right.
The analysis we've been discussing suggests there might be a connection between these reported high losses and the fact that Washington seems to be pushing harder for a ceasefire.
That's an interesting point. It could be that the U.S. administration recognizes just how heavy the casualties have been and that maybe simply sending more weapons isn't going to change the situation on the ground.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I guess what we're looking at is a future where Ukraine faces a really shaky financial situation even after the war ends, and where their military has suffered potentially catastrophic losses.
Yeah.
And those two things are clearly intertwined. I mean, their financial problems are going to make it harder to maintain a strong military, and those massive casualties are going to make it that much harder for them to rebuild their economy and society.
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation all around.
It makes you think about the long-term consequences of this conflict, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole geopolitical landscape. What incredibly difficult choices might lie ahead. Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.